Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earle. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearle.com. In today's interview, I have a conversation with Jessica Lamar. Jessica is a postdoctoral resident with a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the Arizona School of Professional Psychology. Additionally, she has a Master of Arts degree in clinical psychology. Jessica has extensive experience providing individual and group psychotherapy to individuals who suffer from serious mental illness, addictions, sexual offender behaviors, personality disorders, and dual diagnoses. Jessica's specific areas of interest include grief and loss, disenfranchised grief, anxiety, life transitions, codependency, depression, communication skills, and boundary setting. So without further ado, here's the interview with Jessica. So Jessica, thanks for being on the podcast. So we're going to be talking about disenfranchised grief. Will you start by explaining to the listeners what disenfranchised grief is?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So disenfranchised grief, in short, is grief that somebody experiences when they incur a loss that cannot be openly acknowledged or socially sanctioned or publicly mourned. So it's a grief or a loss. It's grief that we have to do in private, or we feel that we have to do in private.
And so could you give some common examples of disenfranchised grief?
Yeah, so yes, would it be helpful if I went into kind of how disenfranchised grief, the term, even came about? Maybe I'll start there.
Sure.
And then I think that'll give some insight into some examples of it.
That's great.
So disenfranchised grief, it was started in the mid-'80s, I think 85 or 86, by Dr. Kenneth Doka. And he's a professor, and he teaches grief and loss. And he was teaching a master's class, and they were talking about grief. And one of his students said that her ex-husband had passed away, and some neighbors, friends had commented, "Oh, don't you feel like you really got him, you won?" And she just felt very confused by that reaction. And from there, Dr. Doka went into kind of talking about this phenomenon of feeling like, what a unique relationship that her ex-husband passed away. And she kind of felt strange in her sadness and her grief, and really felt like she didn't have support around grieving that loss, which was a very, very meaningful relationship for her. Even though their separation was drawn out and there was just a lot of anger and sadness, she still really felt sad and was mourning the loss of her ex-husband, the father of her children. So from there, he started to really kind of dive into what this was and how this showed up in our lives. And it's not just with death, right? It's pets, it's friendships, it's breakups, it's moves, it's so many things that we just kind of go through life thinking that it's no big deal, when really loss after loss, it can kind of weigh on us.
Yeah, and it seems like these with this topic of disenfranchised grief, there's not really socially acceptable places to talk about those experiences. Yeah,
so I think that's a really good point that you bring up, is that there doesn't really feel like there's an opportunity or a place or a person to process, my pet died, or my boss left our job and now I'm feeling the loss of my boss. Right? These losses are unique, and sometimes it doesn't feel like there's a support system around processing that. Sometimes people feel shame even around feeling that they feel sadness around such an abstract or an ambiguous loss.
And then what are some other common examples of people's experiences with disenfranchised grief?
So there's there's probably about 4 or 5 different categories as far as disenfranchised grief and in the way that it shows up. So one being the type of relationship. So sometimes people might feel disenfranchised grief from the death of a close blood relative. Well, that's like typical, right? When the death of a close blood relative passes. But the type of relationship that might be maybe less important by society, may be dismissed, maybe a coworker, an ex-spouse, like we were talking about, a grandparent, a stepchild, a neighbor, even, miscarriages, those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think some other ones that are important to talk about. I can just keep going if you want.
Sure. Oh, that's great.
Is it's the loss that is not socially defined as significant. So this can be, perinatal loss or non-death related losses such as divorce or, incarceration. Sometimes people have family members who get incarcerated, and that's a huge loss for people. Another really big one that isn't necessarily quite as significant, which is definitely is retirement. The losses of our jobs become our identity, and when we're retiring, there's just a whole grieving process in that, and people go through a process of redefining themselves, right? And so they're making meaning in that. I think that's really important. I think also something that fits in here is the loss of a dream or a goal, even the loss of a reputation, and that's just a short list of some ambiguous losses.
Sure. And so when people come and consult you about these losses, what are some helpful maybe coping skills you see people engage in with this loss, or what are some helpful ways that you see people process these sorts of losses?
Such a good question, and I think it starts with acknowledging. I think first and foremost, it's acknowledging the loss. Acknowledging the loss is impactful and that it is in fact a grief process. So I think it starts with validating and normalizing that, although at first maybe you wouldn't have anticipated that this would impact you so much, it is. And that's okay, because what we know to be true is there's no prescription for grief. Right? There's no measure on how meaningful something is to us. And so that's where I start. Sometimes we stay in that place for a while because sometimes it takes a little bit, but sometimes there's some shame around this grief. I think I mentioned that a little bit ago around why am I so sad about the move, right? And there's just so much to unpack there. And after the acknowledgement piece, and then it's going into identifying the emotions associated with it. So grief, of course, is one, and then there's sadness, anger. Sometimes, if a person is a caregiver, sometimes people might feel relieved, and that can feel very confusing. And so it's processing some of that. And then it's acceptance of the emotion and the loss. And then the most important part of the work is finding meaning in the loss. And learning ways to live with the loss, not act like the loss didn't happen, not denying it, but how do I now live my life with this loss? And how do I find joy and meaning with it all?
Well, I'm really drawn.
And that can be.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I was just gonna say, and that can be done in various ways as far as rituals. and really big on creating rituals. And that doesn't have to be, we know the common ritual, right? It is a funeral. But rituals can be anything. And they can be daily, they could be weekly, they could be just on anniversaries. I do this is a primary part of my practice that I work with people on is creating meaningful rituals. It could be saying goodbye to old behaviors, as we are in a changing just growth process. If I'm going to say goodbye to these behaviors that no longer serve me and welcome these new behaviors.
Yeah, I'm really drawn to that piece that you're mentioning there of finding meaning in loss, and that setting up of rituals, whatever is meaningful to the person setting those rituals up. And I'm curious just to hear more about that part of this process of the finding meaning in loss. What are some other things that people that come up with, you know?
As far as finding meaning yet, so it's like you said, it's a process.
Mm.
And I think sometimes the meaning hits us at unexpected times. And a part of grief work is remaining open to that. So
Mm.
much of grief is being angry and confused and trying to process, it isn't fair. I don't have control, all of that kind of stuff. And so it's looking at finding meaning in ways that I do have control over my life. And that could be, I can, I can figure out how I want to acknowledge the loss, the death, whatever it is, every day in my life, and I'm going to do it this way.
Mm.
It could be, I'm trying to pull on an example. It could be having a picture around, and every day your morning ritual is, I'm going to check in with my mother and say good morning to her, and now my meaning is spirituality, right? So that takes a path, spiritual path, because you're connecting to
Mm.
something bigger than a physical being. Um, I also think with finding meaning, it's about connection. So in times of loss, what I find to be so helpful is reminding ourselves that what we need is support, and life is about connection. And
Mm.
so grounding ourselves in that yes, I lost this, and now let me find another way to connect with it, since I can't connect with it in the same way.
Mm. So finding ways to connect with what you have lost still in a different way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then and I think another part of that is a huge part of disenfranchised grief, I think, is future memories. And one of the hardest parts of losing someone or something is this idea of what could have been.
Hmm.
And so in the process of making meaning, it's leaving ourselves open to a wide variety of the future. Right?
Hmm.
So what is my life going to look like without this person, or without this job, or without this pet or home, or whatever it is? It's finding new meaning without those things physically.
Hmm. Sure. And
Viktor Frankl,
mm.
go ahead.
No. Oh, I'm happy to hear you talking about Viktor Frankl. Interested in what you had to
Yeah,
say.
I was just going to mention, of course, his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Hmm.
It really targets that in the toughest times, when we are at a loss for our humanity, essentially, when we can cultivate a process of meaning in our life, it's essentially survival.
Hmm.
But we have to dig down really deep to find that sometimes within ourselves.
Hmm.
And it's not a process that's meant to be done alone. It's
Hmm.
okay to reach out and ask, and ask for help. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a therapist. It could
Sure.
be a friend or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm wondering if there's any like exercises that you've given people, or that like someone might try out if they're experiencing loss, and they're in this process of making meaning.
Yeah, so there's a couple. One being, I can speak personally, and then something that I have definitely assigned to clients is taking an inventory of our losses,
Mm.
um, and really kind of digging deep of looking at, at how much of what we've been talking about, moods, pets, friends, graduation, all of those things, and starting to go back and look at themes and and celebrate. I think, especially if it's things that require a celebration, things that you've accomplished. And then if it's things that are tough losses that make you sad, then you can go back and you can honor them,
Hmm.
and talk about what that meant to me then. Because maybe at the time we didn't know, right? So if you go back and you take an inventory, you're giving yourself a wide range of losses to pull from.
Hmm.
And then and you work up to your present moment, and you can kind of combine it and you can cultivate so much meaning in the present day from all those experiences. That could be anything. That could be, I have found meaning in gratitude, right? Or I have found, my purpose in wanting to serve, in the military as a result of this, right? So much can come if we sit down and really take an inventory
Hmm.
of that. And I'm really big with rituals in making them celebrations. And so inviting
Hmm.
people that you love and that you care about into the process with you, and let
Hmm.
them celebrate with you, let them honor with you and go through this, because we're not meant, like we're saying, to do this alone.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that piece that you're talking about of that connection, and yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't be possible to go through this process of grief and making meaning around the grief and developing these rituals by ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what we're talking about is giving your grief a voice.
Hmm.
Um, and when we can give our grief a voice, we can express ourselves to those that we care about, and express our feelings and emotions to ourselves even. Then that's when we can really start to tap into the creation of meaning and having the rituals. When we start to get curious, and that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so I noticed on your bio that you practice acceptance and commitment therapy, and I'm wondering if you could just give our listeners a brief synopsis of what acceptance and commitment therapy is, and maybe how it plays into this work with grief.
Mm-hmm. Where do I start with ACT? So ACT, developed by Stephen Hayes. So acceptance and commitment looks at a couple different things. So it's looking at cognitions, and it uses a mindfulness practice. Um, and so a huge part, especially in working with grief, that I actually do a lot of my practice is mindfulness.
Hmm.
And so if we can allow ourselves to accept and acknowledge, our grief and our pain and our sadness, and then we can use these mindfulness skills to experience those without judgment,
Hmm.
and really let those be in us, then just to go back to the meaning piece, then we're holding space for ourselves. We're holding space for ourselves in a meaningful way to then say, and this is what I need to do with my grief, or this is what my grief means to me.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's, in short, how I use ACT with grief. And a huge part of ACT is psychological flexibility, which is this ability to expand, ourselves to experience these emotions. And so I use ACT in a way to kind of measure a person's ability to feel their pain, and their ability to hold them, hold the space for themselves. Because ACT believes that they call it experiential avoidance, and so we create these things around us to avoid our pain, which is
Hmm.
just so natural, especially with grief. Um, as normal as loss is, we act like, we're so afraid of it. So when it happens, we're just so shocked and jarred by it. It's life, like that loss. And so I use
Hmm.
ACT in a way to kind of measure, how people are experientially avoiding their grief and their
Hmm.
pain. And then I work to kind of expand their flexibility within that using mindfulness.
Hmm. Yeah, I had a question as you were talking. So for people who
Mm-hmm.
maybe haven't experienced a big loss, a major loss in their life, you were mentioning, for a lot of people when they experience a big loss like that, it's just a bit of a shock and there's so much pain and there's kind of an
Mm-hmm.
avoidance of that. Is there anything that people can do to prepare for loss in their lives?
Mm-hmm. Think about that for 1 second here. Um, Prepare. I don't know if there's something that we can necessarily do to prepare for it, um, because it is so jarring and it's so shocking. It is truly the one thing my kids don't have control over.
Mm.
And so what I think people can do, what I think we can all do, is really lean into talking about it. I think talking about grief, talking about loss,
Mm.
and normalizing the conversation of it, I think is really helpful. We tiptoe around it,
Mm.
which I don't think is helpful for us as a culture, as a society. I think if we can really just start to lean into, we die, people we love, we lose, and that is so painful. And so if
Mm.
we can really just continue the conversation, I think that is in general really helpful. But to prepare on a personal level, I think it depends on each person, and I would just encourage everybody to have the conversation.
Mm.
You know, some practical things, right, is kind of preparing wills and those types of things, making plans, making, what do you want to happen to your body and those types of things, and having those conversations with people that you care about, who you want to be in charge of that stuff.
Mm. Absolutely. Yeah, and it seems like that, as your loved ones would be grieving you at that time, they don't have to think
Mm-hmm.
about those decisions. They know what you would want, and they can focus on their own grieving process.
Yeah, yes, and it is, just from what I hear, that is so helpful when people are in their shock and they're in their pain, that they don't have to make decisions in that
Mm.
sense, because sometimes I think people feel like there's a pressure of, you need to honor, husband, sister, mother, whoever, in such a deep way, and I don't know what they would want.
Mm.
And so they panic, right? So when the panic and fear comes up, and they're in shock for so long, and they're doing all these things, and then sometimes once all that settles, um, then the grief really hits.
Mm.
And so if some of that, kind of like you're talking about, that the background stuff is taken care of first, we might be able to sit with our pain, and connect and reach out for support a little bit easier,
Mm.
maybe,
Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, for those of us who have a loved one, a family member, a friend who has experienced loss, what are some ways that we can best support them?
depending. I want to just first comment that I love that you're asking this question.
Mm.
Because I think what happens a lot of times in grief and loss is the griever ends up having to caretake the people who are trying to support them, because nobody knows what to say or do. And so then the griever is trying to manage another person's discomfort. And so this conversation, I think, is so, so valuable and important, because there are things that aren't helpful. And so I always encourage the griever to let people know. Sometimes it does fall on us to take control of it, to say, this is what I need, or to say, I don't know what I need, and I will let you
Mm.
know. And for our support system to be okay with that. So for them to not go in and try to fix and support. And so I always tell people, ask the griever, what is there anything that you need? How can I support you? And if they say, I don't know, they really don't know.
Mm.
And of course they don't know. And you say, okay. Um, and, of course, not saying things like you understand and those types of things, because you don't, right? We don't
Mm.
understand that person's personal experience.
Sure.
And I also will always tell the griever, if somebody says something to you or does something to you that is not helpful or supportive, it's okay to let them know.
Mm.
Let them know that that's not helpful, so that doesn't keep happening. So they
Sure.
can know. because
Sure.
they don't know.
Hmm.
But I think first and foremost is for somebody who's offering support to another person is to ask. And sometimes people will say, I just want things to be normal. Okay. Then you kind of function, as normal. And when and if somebody is ready to talk, they will.
Hmm.
Like we get so afraid of another person's pain and then we naturally then reflect on our own life and we lose people and so we have to watch for projections
Mm-hmm.
also.
Oh, that's very, very helpful. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of practical tips, and yeah, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because, yeah, I think it's a topic that is not talked about much in our society. You know, there's this ethic of
Mm-hmm.
control that exists, and I think the more privilege people have, the more control they have in their lives, and then yeah, it makes when you lose this control or you see someone around you lose this control, it's I think people kind of grasp at what to do, and it's a topic that is so taboo for these reasons that yeah, I think people just don't put much thought into it. And then, saying something like, "Oh, I understand what you're going through," it's like it's very well intentioned, and then but it
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't it doesn't land because yeah, like you were saying, it's like they're the only one who fully understands their experience, and they might not fully, they're maybe even making sense of it
Mm-hmm.
themselves.
Yeah, yeah. I think that last part that you're talking about is so key here. Is yes, when we are hit with a loss, we barely understand it. We're trying to wrap our heads around it, and so yeah, how can you understand if I don't understand? And then maybe now the griever feels shame that they don't understand, and so
Mm,
there's so many complexities and dynamics to loss. Um, and I think by saying this, I understand, then it's putting an assumption on the griever. Like we mentioned a little bit ago, sometimes somebody might feel relieved, and so they might feel some shame about that, where maybe they don't feel as sad right away, or they're not reacting in what society would consider typical.
mm, mm,
Um, and so I think that's an important piece, to look at too, is preconceived notions of, what grief looks like. Um, and so those statements, and I understand, it's okay or whatever, it can feel to a person who's grieving just unsupported and can sometimes isolate the griever even more.
mm,
Um, and when we're in loss and we're grieving, we lose somebody or something or a place that's so meaningful to us. We're essentially losing a sense of safety. So we're really trying to reestablish that. And if our support system isn't able to provide that for us, then we're even more in fear and panic.
mm.
So I think another thing that you can just simply ask for somebody who's grieving is, or say to them is, I'm here to support you in whatever way you need, whatever that looks like for you. And I understand you might not know that right
Mm,
now. I'm here
mhm,
to support.
mm. Well, is there
And,
anything?
and
Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
I I was just curious if there's anything else that comes to mind for you that we haven't touched on this topic of disenfranchised grief or grief in general that you'd want to share.
There's a couple things. I think with disenfranchised grief, something to really consider is sometimes there's the cause of the loss is considered socially unacceptable, and so some people might struggle grieving those in public, and that could be drunk driving, violence, addiction, suicide. Those things are considered taboo in our society,
Mm,
and so a griever who loses somebody to those circumstances might tend to isolate more than somebody else. So I think that's something to really be mindful of. And I think another part of disenfranchised grief is some people some people are considered incapable of grieving based on the social perspective, and that children, right? A lot of people think that children can't grieve. The mentally, the elderly, the seriously mentally ill, those people kind of get kind of pushed to the side, like they're fine, they don't understand. That's what we hear a lot with that type of population around grief, and that's of course not true. They might understand it differently, or they're making meaning, and so as a support or provider, it's again just being really mindful and aware that everybody acknowledges and experiences these things so differently.
Sure.
I really wanted to touch on those. And then I think another thing I just really focused on right now with grief is, of course, in this moment that we're in the pandemic.
Sure.
Is we are all grieving. We're all grieving all the major loss of our routines and our normalcy. And I think putting grief to that and acknowledging it as grief can help us find meaning as we adjust to our new normal, and whatever that looks like, which will look different for everyone. And I think that is just such a powerful way to kind of look at everything that's happening as our lack of safety, and of course the many people who are dying, and so honoring that, and that we're all, we're human, and we're vulnerable and fragile. And sometimes there's grief when we're grounded in, I'm at risk as well. So we kind of just have to shift our way of being. So I wanted to comment on that as well.
Sure. Well, thanks for that. I think that is, it's so relevant as you're saying. And I think that, as we've been talking, it's so important to acknowledge the loss and the grief that we've had, although some might just dismiss it as insignificant with all the shifts we're seeing with the pandemic. I appreciate that reminder to take time to acknowledge that with others. I'm moved to do that with my wife, just acknowledge the changes that have happened in our lives and some of the norms that we've lost, and just attend to that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and so something, we can make meaning in that and do a ritual with, okay, now I work from home, or whatever it is. What's my new routine, and how can I create, something different in this. And like you and I were talking before, it's for me the loss of seeing my clients in person, and connecting with people in that way, especially doing grief work. The compound loss, as it's called, and so I think acknowledging that all of these are losses, and I think what's most important when we talk about grief and we talk about loss and we talk about such tragedy is that as humans, we are built for this, and we can cope with this. We just really have to learn how to do it, but we are absolutely built for it. And so I hope that can maybe reduce some fear and panic about grief in general.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming to the end of the interview here, Jessica. You were just kind of speaking to this last question that I generally ask, but maybe something else will come to mind. The question I like to ask people at the end is, what's the message of hope that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yes, definitely that we are built for this. And my message would be that what we are all going through, it's our own experience and it's our truth. And we are worthy of it. And our hearts and our minds and our bodies will guide us in the direction that we need to go. Trust in that.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for being on the podcast, and hopefully we can do another one sometime.
That would be great. Thank you.
Please press the subscribe button. as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you. Lastly, I wanted to mention that Psychological Counseling Services is currently offering teletherapy. If you're interested in therapy at this time, please visit pcsearl.com. As long as there is a state of emergency in place, PCS will be offering teletherapy.